Hello, this is Kevin Siepel, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 2nd issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an article entitled, Gaza Crossing to Egypt Reopens in Step Forward for Fragile Ceasefire. Israel and Egypt had disagreed for months about how to resume operations at the Rafah border crossing, which has been largely closed since May 2024. By Isabel Kirshner and Bilal Shabar. The sole border crossing between Gaza and Egypt reopened on Monday after being largely closed for 20 minutes, a symbolic, if halting, step forward in Israel's ceasefire with Hamas. The reopening of the crossing in the Rafah area of southern Gaza will for the first time allow some Gazans who fled during the two-year war to return, but only in limited numbers for now. It is also expected to expedite the exit of thousands of sick and wounded people waiting for medical treatment abroad. The hope is that the reopening of the Rafah crossing will be a move toward gradually improving conditions for Palestinians in Gaza. But in a seemingly faltering start of the operation, only a small number of Palestinians appeared to have received clearances to pass through the crossing on Monday morning. It was unclear by nightfall how many Palestinians had crossed the border in either direction. At a Palestinian Red Crescent Society hospital in Khan Yunis, a city in southern Gaza, a minibus departed for the Rafah crossing shortly after 1 p.m. with 5 patients, each accompanied by 2 caregivers. Mohammed Mahdi, 25, was escorting his father, Akram Mahdi, 61, a mechanical engineer. The elder Mr. Mahdi was wounded in April 2024 in an Israeli airstrike near their home, in a refugee camp in central Gaza, according to his son. Shrapnel tore his face, blinding him in his right eye and damaging his left one. Doctors in Gaza could do little more than stabilize him, his son said. Finally, we can get advanced medical treatment abroad, Mohammed Mahdi said before boarding the minibus. Israel and Egypt disagreed for months over the terms of the reopening, which is part of President Trump's plan for ending the Gaza war. A shaky ceasefire took effect in October, but Israel kept the crossing closed as leverage until the last of the hostages seized in the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023, were returned to Israel, alive or dead. A week ago, the Israeli military said it had retrieved the remains of the last remaining captive, Master Sergeant Ran Givli, a police officer who was shot during the October 7th attack, which set off the war. Underscoring the fragility of the ceasefire, the Israeli military launched a series of airstrikes on Saturday in Gaza that killed at least 26 people, including several children, according to local health officials. The Israeli military said it had targeted militants and weapons facilities in response to what it called a violation of the ceasefire by Hamas fighters in the Rafah area the day before. Before Israel seized the Rafah crossing in May 2024, it was a lifeline and a pressure valve for Gaza's roughly 2 million residents. Israel and Egypt have tightly controlled the territory's land borders for years, and Israel has long maintained a naval blockade on the enclave, citing a need to stop weapons smuggling. The passage opened briefly during a temporary ceasefire last winter, but only to allow some Gazans to leave the enclave to obtain medical treatment abroad. Now that it has been opened again, the crossing will be strictly supervised and operated in a limited capacity, with dozens of people allowed at first to enter or exit each day, according to officials. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said last week that Israel would be in charge of overall security, though Israeli forces would not be present at the crossing. He suggested that about 50 people might be let in daily and that more would be allowed to leave. We are not going to prevent anyone from leaving, he said. At least initially, truckloads of goods will not be allowed in via the Rafah crossing. A daily list of people planning to enter or leave Gaza will be submitted by Egypt to the Israeli authorities for vetting, according to officials familiar with the details of the arrangements. They said a civilian security team from the European Union would monitor the crossing with the help of employees of the Palestinian Authority, which administers parts of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. That is a system similar to the one used in the past. Because the Gaza side of the crossing is in the half of the enclave that Israel now controls, travel to and from the border on the Gaza side will be closely coordinated with Israeli authorities. There will be an additional screening and identification process for people entering, they said, to take place in a designated corridor operated by Israeli security personnel in the area under Israeli military control. The National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, a group of Palestinian technocrats charged with helping govern the territory, was still in Cairo on Monday. Members of the committee hoped to enter Gaza soon, but a specific date for their arrival had not been set as of Monday morning, according to 4 people briefed on the committee's work who insisted on anonymity to describe it. In the Egyptian capital, the committee has been putting together plans for aiding and rebuilding Gaza, participating in governance training, and meeting with officials, 3 of the people said. Ali Shath, the committee's leader, posted a statement on social media on Monday calling for the crossings reopening the beginning of a long process that will reconnect what has been severed and open a genuine window of hope for our people in the Gaza Strip. For those wanting to leave Gaza, priority will be given to the sick and the wounded who have been approved for treatment abroad, said a member of the European Border Monitoring Mission, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the delicate talks about the reopening. Roughly 18,500 people, including 4,000 children, are on the list of patients to be evacuated, according to the United Nations. Patients are usually accompanied by at least one relative or caregiver. Other Gazans are in Egypt waiting to return. Manal Abu Amuna left Gaza with her daughter, Hiba, 25, who was severely wounded in an Israeli airstrike near their home in February 2024. They went to Egypt to seek medical treatment. Miss Abu Amuna's husband and their 9 other children stayed behind. For 2 years I've been alone with my daughter, she said by telephone. She said they had been living on charity in Cairo, where they felt like strangers. During their absence, she said, one of her sons, Mohammed, was critically injured in another Israeli strike. I want to go back to Gaza, even with all the rubble there, Miss Abu Amuna said. About 80% of the buildings in Gaza were damaged or destroyed in the war, according to the United Nations, and many civilians are living in tents among the debris. Mr. Netanyahu has said that Gaza will not be rebuilt until it has been demilitarized. The next stage of the ceasefire agreement is fraught with uncertainties. It calls for Hamas to disarm, but the militants are reluctant to do so. For the first 9 months of the war, tens of thousands of Palestinians were able to flee to Egypt through the Rafah crossing. Many paid bribes to secure exit papers using intermediaries connected with the Egyptian government, while others were sponsored by international aid groups. After Israel seized the crossing as part of a military campaign to seal off Gaza's southern border, all traffic came to a halt. Operations at the crossing resumed briefly in January 2025 under the terms of a temporary ceasefire, but only for a limited amount of traffic out of Gaza. When Israel resumed fighting in March 2025, the crossing closed again. Gaza has not been hermetically sealed. In September, the Israeli military unit responsible for coordinating with Palestinian officials over civilian affairs said that hundreds of Gazans in need of medical treatment, along with caregivers, had left the enclave, as well as some Gaza residents with dual citizenship. They passed through another land crossing at the juncture of the borders of Israel, Egypt, and Gaza, then traveled overland to Jordan, or flew out of an airport in southern Israel. The World Health Organization says it has helped facilitate nearly 2,700 medical evacuations since the Rafah crossing closed in May 2024. But the closure of the Rafah crossing cut off a key pipeline. During the talks, Egypt insisted that the crossing reopen for traffic in both directions. Israel's right-wing government has made no secret of its desire to see as many Gazans as possible leave and not return. End of article. Here's an article entitled How the Supreme Court Secretly Made Itself Even More Secretive. Amid calls to increase transparency and revelations about the court's inner workings, the Chief Justice imposed non-disclosure agreements on clerks and employees. By Jody Cantor. In November of 2024, 2 weeks after voters returned President Donald Trump to office, Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr. summoned employees of the U.S. Supreme Court for an unusual announcement. Facing them in a grand conference room beneath ornate chandeliers, he requested they each sign a non-disclosure agreement, promising to keep the court's inner workings secret. The Chief Justice acted after a series of unusual leaks of internal court documents, most notably of the decision overturning the right to abortion, and news reports about ethical lapses by the justices. Trust in the institution was languishing at a historic low. Debate was intensifying over whether the black box institution should be more transparent. Instead, the Chief Justice tightened the court's hold on information. Its employees have long been expected to stay silent about what they witnessed behind the scenes, but starting that autumn, in a move that has not been previously reported, the Chief Justice converted what was once a norm into a formal contract, according to 5 people familiar with the shift. Over the years, journalists and authors have sought to penetrate the court, and the justices have tried varying methods to guard its secrets. Some generations of clerks, but not others, said they were asked to sign a different kind of confidentiality pledge. The New York Times has not reviewed the new agreements, but people familiar with them said they appeared to be more forceful and understood them to threaten legal action if an employee revealed confidential information. Clerks and members of the court's support staff signed them in 2024, and new arrivals have continued to do so, the people said. A spokeswoman for the court declined to comment about the non-disclosure agreements. She also did not respond to a question about whether the justices have been asked to sign the contracts. The people who described the agreements spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly about court matters. The justices are accustomed to controlling what the public knows about their work, sealing nearly everything but their oral arguments and written opinions behind a high wall of secrecy. Courts are excluded from the open records laws that require many other government bodies to maintain and make available internal information. The justices claim their papers belong to them, not the government or the public, and generally arrange to have them locked away until long after their deaths. The court releases no visitor logs to reveal who meets with the justices. But in 2022, in a shock to many at the court, someone leaked a draft of the court's decision overturning the federal right to abortion to Politico, which published the document weeks before the justices had intended to make it public. The court conducted an investigation of its staff, but mostly spared the justices, and the source was never publicly identified. More recently, the Times has been regularly publishing stories illuminating the court's inner workings, including accounts of sensitive debates among the justices. In September 2024, the Times published an article describing how the Chief Justices pushed to grant President Trump broad immunity from prosecution. The article quoted from confidential memos by the Chief Justice and other members of the court who applauded his reasoning. Weeks later, the Chief Justice abruptly introduced the non-disclosure agreements after the term had begun. Before then, the Chief Justice, fond of referring to court members and employees as a family, relied on softer measures to preserve confidentiality, delivering a lecture to clerks at the start of each term and distributing a written code of conduct to them. The law clerk owes the appointing justice, all other justices, and the court as an institution duties of complete confidentiality, accuracy, and loyalty, instructed a 2018 version obtained by the Times, in which every page is labeled confidential for authorized internal use only. The final page mentioned that breaches could lead to appropriate sanctions, but did not specify what those might be. Some Supreme Court clerks who served in past decades also recall being asked to sign a document agreeing to abide by the court's rules of confidentiality. A version of the agreement was introduced in the years after a former clerk published a rare tell-all book in 1998, they said. Those clerks said the documents did not amount to legal non-disclosure agreements. Peter Kaplan, a spokesman for the federal courts, said other judges have also used those kinds of pledges in the past, though he and others did not believe they were currently in widespread use. He said the judiciary's code of conduct includes confidentiality requirements. Former clerks and academics told by the Times about the Supreme Court's new non-disclosure agreements said they were a sign that the justices felt they could no longer rely on more informal pledges or long-standing norms to guard their internal workings from public view. They feel under the microscope and are unwilling to rely simply on trust, said Jeffrey L. Fisher, co-director of the Supreme Court Litigation Clinic at Stanford Law School and a former clerk to Justice John Paul Stevens. The switch to formal contracts is a sign of the court's own weakness and the erosion of an internal compact, said Mark Fenster, a law professor at the University of Florida. Court employees see the justices' maneuverings, their compromises, tensions, and reversals. They read the memos and draft opinions that tell the story of how the law is really shaped. That includes the secret negotiations behind so-called shadow docket decisions, emergency orders the court issues, often with little or no public rationale. Since Mr. Trump took office, the court has repeatedly issued such emergency orders, allowing him to implement his agenda. Legal experts say the new agreements may be more effective at scaring employees than at legally binding them. Such agreements are tricky to enforce even in typical workplaces, they say, and most likely harder at the Supreme Court. Non-disclosure agreements are a paradox, said Mr. Fenster, because seeking to enforce them risks further exposing the very information they are designed to conceal. If the employer has to go to court to enforce a damages claim or an injunction, you're in public, he said. For the nation's highest court to bring legal action against an employee could create its own puzzle, he and others said. Who would represent the Supreme Court? Mr. Fenster asked. The arguments may complicate another Supreme Court tradition, former clerks cashing in on what they learned there. Law firms now pay clerks signing bonuses as high as $500,000. The court requires them to avoid working on its own cases for 2 years. But after that, former clerks often spend the rest of their careers monetizing the knowledge they gained from working directly with the justices and also reading still secret older case files, some said in interviews. While they are not supposed to share specifics with clients, plenty of details slip out, the former clerks said. The debate over whether the Supreme Court is too secretive has played out since the nation's earliest days. In 1821, Thomas Jefferson wrote that the institution was smothering evidence and that the nation needed to know more about the character of the justices who are appointed for life. Now, even as some observers of the court call for it to be more transparent, judges, including the justices, generally defend the long-standing tradition of keeping their decision-making private. I don't see any need on the public's part to see the internal deliberations, said Paul J. Watford, a retired federal judge appointed by President Barack Obama. What you're trying to do as a judge in interacting with your colleagues is be completely open and wrestle with the difficult questions, he added. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Leaks discourage judges from changing their minds and undermine the ability of the court to function as a collegial body, he said. Justices have long warned of the dangers of opening their private deliberations, saying it could undermine their independence and tend to lobbying pressures, as Justice William H. Rehnquist, who later became chief, put it in a 1977 speech arguing for secrecy. More recently, Justice Amy Coney Barrett relayed what Justice Antonin Scalia, her own former boss, used to tell new clerks. He would say, "If you ever leak information now or at any point in your lifetime about what happened in this court, I will hunt you down and destroy your career," she said in a talk last September at the University of Notre Dame. She said she now gives her clerks a similar warning, though in less dire terms. But once the decisions have been announced and as time passes, the arguments for opacity fade, said Daniel Epps, a law professor at Washington University School of Law and former clerk to Justice Anthony M. Kennedy. The justices have immense power. They're not elected. That power depends on our consent as a democracy, and we have some interest in seeing how they're using their power and making decisions, he said. The secrecy allows the justices to dismiss criticism on the grounds that outsiders don't know or understand what's happening behind the scenes, said Nicholas Bowie, a Harvard Law School professor who served as a clerk to Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Many of the court's decisions are being made out of the public eye in a way that makes it difficult to assess or criticize them, or to understand what actually motivated the justices, he said. The lack of transparency makes it difficult for the broader public to know how to respond. He said it also allows the court to conceal weaknesses in its processes, including the justices' reliance on clerks for legal reasoning and writing. If the public were aware of how much the deliberations affecting millions of people are made by 27-year-olds after happy hour, they'd be shocked, he said. End of article. Here's an article entitled, "Trump Had Unusual Call with FBI Agents After Election Center Search." Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, brokered the call, and President Trump directly questioned frontline agents on the inquiry, the Times has learned. By William K. Rashbaum, Devlin Barrett, and Julian E. Barnes. By any measure, the FBI's search of an election center in Fulton County, Georgia last week was extraordinary. Agents seized truckloads of 2020 ballots as President Trump harnessed the levers of government to not only buttress his false claims of widespread voter fraud, but also to try to build a criminal case against those he believes wronged him. What happened the next day was in some ways even more unusual, the New York Times has learned. Behind closed doors, Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, met with some of the same FBI agents, members of the Bureau's field office in Atlanta, which is conducting the election inquiry. 3 people with knowledge of the meeting said. They could not say why Miss Gabbard, who also appeared on site at the search, was there, but her continued presence has raised eyebrows, given that her role overseeing the nation's intelligence agencies does not include on-site involvement in criminal investigative work. What occurred during the meeting was even further outside the bounds of normal law enforcement procedure. Ms. Gabbard used her cell phone to call Mr. Trump, who did not initially pick up but called back shortly after, the people said. The president addressed the agents on speakerphone, asking them questions as well as praising and thanking them for their work on the inquiry, the three people said. The supervisor of the squad, which investigates allegations of public corruption and civil rights violations and developed the evidence for the search, primarily fielded Mr. Trump's queries, the people said. One U.S. official said the call was fairly short, perhaps just a minute long, and compared the conversation to a pep rally or a coach giving an encouraging halftime speech to his players. That person said the president gave no substantive direction to the investigators. In a letter to lawmakers who were pressing for more details, Ms. Gabbard denied that Mr. Trump asked questions or issued directives during the call. Mr. Trump personally ordered Ms. Gabbard to go to Atlanta for the search and coordinated her actions with Andrew Bailey, one of two deputy FBI directors, according to the U.S. official. Even for a president who has radically transformed the Justice Department and the FBI by trampling over their political independence and using them as tools for personal retribution, Mr. Trump appears to be taking that kind of involvement to a new level. Rather than going to senior department or FBI officials, Mr. Trump spoke directly to the frontline agents doing the granular work of a politically sensitive investigation in which he has a large personal stake. A White House spokesman, David Engel, defended the administration's efforts in Georgia. President Trump pledged to secure America's elections, and he has tasked the most talented team of patriots to do just that, Mr. Engel said, adding, President Trump has full confidence in his entire team. Olivia C. Coleman, a spokeswoman for Ms. Gabbard, said the Director of National Intelligence had a vital role in protecting critical infrastructure and analyzing intelligence related to election security. President Trump's directive to secure our elections was clear, and DNI Gabbard has and will proudly continue to take actions within her authorities, alongside our interagency partners, including the FBI, to support ensuring the integrity of our elections, she said. A spokesperson for the Justice Department declined to comment, and the FBI declined to comment on an open investigation. Mr. Trump's interaction is a major departure from past practice. It is extremely dangerous to our democracy and a shocking abandonment of years of sound policy for the president to be directly involved in the conduct of domestic criminal investigations, especially one that seeks to redress his personal grievances and to make the Director of National Intelligence an instrument of his political will, said David Laufman, who served as a senior Justice Department official in both Republican and Democratic administrations. It is now more clear than ever that the independence of the Department of Justice and the FBI is completely compromised, and they are essentially under the direction and control of the White House. Last month, the president, in declaring once again that the 2020 election had been stolen from him, left little doubt about his intentions. People will soon be prosecuted for what they did, he said in remarks at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. In an appearance on CNN's State of the Union on Sunday, the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, denied that Mr. Trump had played any role in the search or that he had been briefed on the inquiry. I don't believe he was involved, he said. This is a criminal grand jury investigation, and I can't comment on it. Pressed on Ms. Gabbard's involvement, Mr. Blanche said he did not know the reasons for her presence, but he nonetheless appeared to suggest that it was not unusual. I don't know why the director was there, Mr. Blanche said. She is not part of the grand jury investigation, but she is for sure a key part of our efforts at election integrity and making sure we have free and fair elections. She's an expert in that space, and it's a big part of what she and her team look at every day. The American official said that Mr. Trump had ordered Ms. Gabbard to go to Georgia to assist with the FBI's investigation. Other officials have said that the White House had given Ms. Gabbard far-reaching authority to hunt for voter fraud in multiple states. Democrats in Congress have said her appearance at the search raised troubling questions, including whether it was appropriate for an intelligence official to participate in what is primarily a domestic issue. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia reiterated those worries in a statement on Monday. The involvement of the Director of National Intelligence in a domestic criminal matter, far outside her statutory role, only deepens those concerns and demands immediate scrutiny, he said. Ms. Gabbard maintained that she was acting squarely within her powers, saying in her letter to lawmakers that her general counsel's office had found my actions to be consistent and well within my statutory authorities. By speaking directly with the investigators, Mr. Trump may have provided significant ammunition to any future defense should the investigation yield criminal charges. His conversation with the agents would probably become part of an effort to have the case dismissed as a vindictive prosecution. Alternatively, if such a case went to trial, defense lawyers would presumably try to elicit testimony from the FBI agents who spoke to the president in the early stages of the investigation, or possibly from Mr. Trump himself. The search itself raises serious questions. It is unclear what evidence was presented to a federal magistrate judge to establish probable cause for a search warrant for the ballots and other materials, which are now more than 5 years old. But multiple prior investigations, including one at the end of Mr. Trump's first term by the same FBI office and federal prosecutors working at the time for the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Atlanta, found no evidence to support his false claims of significant voter fraud. In 2023, Rudolph W. Giuliani, a longtime Trump ally, was ordered to pay $148 million in civil damages for defaming 2 Fulton County election workers, wrongfully accusing them of having tried to steal votes from Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump narrowly lost Georgia in 2020 by about 11,000 votes, prompting an effort by him and his supporters to, quote, find, unquote, enough votes to change the outcome. Despite his bid to undermine the integrity of the election, a manual review of the ballots confirmed the result. In recent months, however, both the president and his administration have sought to cast fresh doubt on the 2020 results in Georgia. Before the search last week, in which agents confiscated voter rolls and scanner images, in addition to ballots, senior Justice Department officials had sued to try to acquire the voter evidence that is now in the FBI's possession. 3 weeks before the search, on January 6th, agents hand-delivered a letter to the Fulton County Board of Elections demanding the same materials written by Paul Brown, then the special agent in charge of the Atlanta field office, a county official said. The county responded that the election board did not have custody of those records and that the Bureau would have to submit an amended request to the county clerk's office, the official said. That amended request, the official said, was quickly submitted by Paul Ellis, Mr. Brown's chief deputy. Mr. Brown filed his resignation papers with the FBI about a week before the search warrant was executed. It is part of a broader effort by the department to obtain voter data. Already it has sued nearly half the states in the country for access to their voter rolls, including the private information of voters. The search and the administration's flood of lawsuits against states have alarmed election officials and experts who worry that the moves are laying the groundwork for the administration to contest the results of this year's congressional midterms. End of article. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an article from the opinion section entitled, "This is Not a Drill," by David French. It's only February, and the November elections are already in peril. When I think back to the days and weeks before January 6, 2021, One thing that's clear is that many of us suffered from a failure of imagination. We knew President Trump's lies and conspiracy mongering were dangerous, but it's hard to think of a single person who predicted that a MAGA mob would storm the Capitol. Very few people anticipated the sheer scale and scope of the effort to overturn the election, or that an incredible 147 Republicans would vote not to certify Joe Biden's clear and unambiguous presidential victory. We did not realize that they would go along with something that plainly corrupt and dangerous. We must not make that mistake again. And so, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to ask you to imagine alongside me. But this is a different kind of imagination. It's based on real events, things that are already occurring right in front of our eyes. So, here we go. It's Friday, October 30th, 2026, and the president's approval rating is low, abysmally low. He hasn't been able to reverse the gradual decline that began after his inauguration. At the end of January, his aggregate approval rating was 41.4%, and his disapproval rating was 55.7%. In June, his approval dropped below 40%, and it hasn't come back up. Meanwhile, Democrats are leading the generic ballot by a wide margin, and Democratic voters are far more enthusiastic about going to the polls than Republicans. In a normal midterm election, this would mean that Democrats would easily take control of the House of Representatives. They could even win the Senate. But this is not a normal election year. Now, in October, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which rapidly expanded throughout the year, is running large-scale operations in Democratic-controlled cities. Hundreds, if not thousands, more American citizens have been caught in the dragnet. So have thousands of lawful residents. Citizens, lawful residents, and undocumented immigrants alike have been shackled and transported to brutal detention facilities in Texas and Florida. Despite repeated court orders holding that federal officials cannot stop, much less detain, anyone purely on the basis of perceived ethnicity, the stops are still happening on a daily basis in cities across the United States. Not only has the administration defied hundreds of court orders, it also refuses to discipline rogue officers. A complex web of federal immunities and privileges further insulates these officers from both private lawsuits and state prosecutions. As a result, non-white citizens are reluctant to go anywhere near ICE, and rumors of ICE conducting operations near polling stations spread like wildfire. Thousands upon thousands of citizens choose to stay home rather than risk arrest to vote. During early voting, reports of citizens discovering they're no longer on the voting rolls have multiplied. Most of them have Latin, African, or Asian-sounding names. The voters named Smith or Jones have had no problems. But if you're a Gonzalez or a Diallo, then you've been purged. Meanwhile, the FBI has raided several election offices in blue cities. Lawmakers in red states have moved to take over election administration in certain blue cities, citing the president's raids and indictments as justification. At the same time, his base has continued to radicalize. Democratic protests against the ICE deployments are viewed in these quarters as proof that Democrats want undocumented immigrants to vote, that they can't win without them. The president himself stokes their anxiety and their anger. His social media feeds are full of the wildest accusations, constantly repeating even the most specious conspiracy theories about the 2016 and 2020 elections. He keeps up his calls to arrest former President Barack Obama. He also calls for the arrest of Democratic governors and lawmakers. He tells his base, the people who trust him more than any news source, that the Democratic Party is a criminal enterprise and that its members will destroy the country if they win the midterms. Right-wing media is full of mugshots of heavily tattooed, scowling criminals that ICE has allegedly yanked from the streets. The banner on the television underneath their mugshots reads, "Democrat voters." President Trump's raids and indictments proved to them that they were right all along. The 2020 election was corrupt. And when federal judges issue injunctions requiring federal law enforcement to stay away from polling places, that's all the proof they need to raise the alarm. This election is rigged, they shout, and they're right, just not in the way they think. The horrifying thing about our current moment is that not a single aspect of the scenario above is far-fetched. In fact, some of it is already happening. Not only did the FBI raid a Georgia election center last week, Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, was present. She's a cabinet-level official responsible for coordinating the activities of American intelligence agencies. Yet there she was in Fulton County, Georgia. The Wall Street Journal reports that Gabbard has turned much of her attention to investigating the 2020 election, an election that withstood dozens of legal challenges. According to the Journal, she's investigating possible foreign interference. The search warrant itself contains a claim that there is probable cause to believe that there is property, data, or information at the Fulton County Election Office that is evidence of the commission of a criminal offense. In the days after the search, 2 Republican-appointed members of the state election board said that it was on the radar as an avenue we could take to seize control of elections in Fulton County. 90% of Atlanta lies within the county. Even if federal agents are seizing American citizens, there is an enormous amount of evidence that they are racially profiling their suspects and mistreating their detainees. Even if federal agents don't show up at polling places, the presence of armed federal agents at the polls is prohibited by federal criminal law. They raise the risk of travel even for American citizens who might look Hispanic by blanketing majority Hispanic parts of any given city. But criminal law is no impediment to Trump. He'll just pardon the violent men and women who break federal law to keep him in power. And if federal courts enjoin ICE activities, would anyone trust Trump to comply? As the Republican-appointed chief judge for the Federal District Court of Minnesota wrote last week, ICE has likely violated more court orders in January 2026 than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, sent Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota a letter promising to bring an end to the chaos in his state if he agreed to a list of demands, including granting Justice Department officials access to its voter rolls. After the FBI raided the Fulton County Election Center, Trump demanded Obama's arrest on social media and threatened the prosecution of election workers. He claimed, among other things, that Italian military satellites had backed the 2020 election, had rather hacked the 2020 election, and that Obama had conspired with foreign powers, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 times to overthrow the United States government in 2016. The Italian satellite theory is a jolting reminder that Trump will demand that his core supporters believe almost anything he says, no matter how wild or delusional. As Jonathan Karl reported for ABC News, this theory was brought to the White House by a woman who went by several aliases, including the Heiress, and was known at the Pentagon for her claimed ties to Somali pirates. Rather than discarding the theory as obvious nonsense from an unreliable narrator, Karl says that then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows directed both the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense to look into the matter. Informed readers will know that this column is woefully incomplete. I can't possibly compile all of Trump's threats against American elections into a single column. Entire books have been written describing his plot to disrupt the 2020 election. But one thing is quite clear. He is more dangerous now than he was then. His party controls the House and the Senate. In 2020, Democrats controlled the House. Trump has filled his administration with cronies and true believers, and his Attorney General is one of his chief enforcers. In 2020, Bill Barr, who was then the Attorney General, resigned rather than continue to pursue Trump's stolen election claims. This time around, by contrast, Ed Martin, a Justice Department official, posted a picture of himself standing next to Sidney Powell, one of the chief legal architects of Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election. In 2023, she pleaded guilty to 6 counts of conspiracy to commit intentional interference with performance of election duties. The president pardoned her in November. And what was Martin's message? Good morning, America. How are you? During his first term, the Trump administration largely complied with federal court orders. In his second term, his administration is defying the courts at a frequency that boggles the mind. So even if Trump-appointed judges and justices repeat their courageous performance from 2020 and block any effort by the president to overturn the next election, it's an open question whether the Trump administration will care. A president who doesn't care about the law, who commands an obedient Congress, and is supported by a radicalized base of tens of millions of people who believe his lies, represents a threat to the next election. I fear that millions of citizens are still too complacent. They aren't aware of the peril we face. And as you take note of each of the incidents I mentioned, you may realize that Trump can unlawfully influence an election without explicitly rigging the count. By deterring his enemies from coming to the polls, he can engineer the outcomes he seeks. In a future column, I'll try to describe what can be done to stop him, aside from simply hoping and praying that his lawlessness has limits other than his own morality. But a nation won't rouse itself if it doesn't hear the alarm. So consider this to be something like a fire drill. It's an alarm, one of thousands that should be ringing across the country. MAGA's acts of aggression are already intimidating. Trump isn't just trying to stop the steal again. Another kind of theft might already be underway. End of article. Here are some letters to the editor. This one is from Kevin J. O'Connor from Bremerton, Washington. To the editor, President Trump actually has a point about nationalizing elections, though perhaps not in the way he thinks he does. Our current system generally works pretty well in that each state runs its own elections. This makes total sense for statewide offices, the House and the Senate. It would be stupid, for example, for non-New Yorkers to be able to vote for the members of Congress who would represent New York. The office of president is different, though. The presidency and the vice presidency are the only offices for which voters in all states cast ballots. As we have seen over the last few elections, the differences in the way each state runs its elections can cause problems. It occurred to me a while back that presidential elections might run more smoothly if governed by the same set of rules and procedures in all states. That would suggest that either the Federal Election Commission, or preferably a nonpartisan group, should oversee presidential balloting, with House, Senate, and statewide elections left to the states. By having one consistent set of rules that applies in all states, we could avoid problems like hanging chads, some states allowing mail-in ballots while others do not, and so on. End of letter. Here's a letter to the editor regarding an article titled Stop Mutilating Classical Music to Sell It to Kids by Evan Shinners. The letter was written by Anthony Rudell of Rockport, Massachusetts. Mr. Shinners' essay makes an important point. The classical music business is in trouble, and the efforts he and others have made to engage children are laudable, but the issue is far greater and needs bigger solutions. We are now into the third generation of Americans whose exposure to classical music has been minimal. In-school music exposure is usually an afterthought. The number of radio stations that play classical music has steadily decreased, and the press that music receives is limited at best. Once upon a time, classical musicians, especially opera stars, were regular guests on TV's late-night shows. Those stars are gone now, and so is the vital exposure. What is needed is a well-funded campaign to expose audiences of all ages to the benefits of classical music, with the intent of making it accessible, fun, and entertaining. Because what the industry has failed to acknowledge and deal with is that classical music is competing not against just other forms of music, but against all forms of entertainment. The soulful, beautiful music deserves to be part of that universe. Here's a letter written in response to an article, "If Science Keeps Changing, Why Trust It?" It is written by Robert A. Phillips and H. Dirk Sostman from Houston, Texas. Professor Scheck offers a thoughtful argument for what he calls disciplined trust in science, a position that avoids both naive faith and unfounded skepticism. To regain public confidence in science, we would add that earning such trust depends as much on how science is communicated as on how it is conducted. Public mistrust of science accelerated during the COVID pandemic, when changing guidance was viewed by many as either deceptive or revealing feet of clay. In fact, those changes reflected science working as it should, responding to new evidence virtually in real time during an emergency. To rebuild trust, scientists and public health leaders must communicate not only scientific facts, but also the process of science itself: testing, revising, questioning, and learning. When science or public health guidance changes, explanations should begin not with "we were wrong," but with "new evidence now shows." Revision is not a weakness of science. It is fundamental to its process, and clear communication of this is a mark of integrity. Disciplined trust grows when science openly and consistently shows how it arrives at its conclusions. End of letter. Here is a letter in response to an article entitled "Upheaval Unsettles National Symphony" from the Arts section of January 28th, and it's written by Dale Kaplan, who lives in Guadalajara, Mexico. Kudos to the composer Philip Glass for refusing to have the current administration sully the meaning of his work. Mr. Glass's refusal to allow the performance of his commissioned work at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts is a testament to the power artists ought to exercise in determining the conditions in which their work is presented. That, after all, is part of the socio-political context that all art participates in once it is shared with the public, whether the work is ostensibly political or not. Since Mr. Glass's symphony was written to honor Abraham Lincoln and the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy Center, it is even more crucial that he be protected from the avaricious desire of the current president to glom onto the well-earned significance and prestige of truly important presidents like Lincoln and Kennedy. End of article. Here is a letter written in regard to an article entitled "We Need to Wake Up After Minneapolis" by Mike Lawler, opinion guest essay, January 28th. The letter is written by Peter Doring of Saunderstown, Rhode Island. Representative Lawler, Republican of New York, advocates bipartisan reform of our immigration system, an American solution to the problems we are now facing. It is worth noting that in early 2024, before the presidential election, 3 U.S. senators, James Lankford, Republican of Oklahoma, Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, and Kyrsten Sinema, Independent of Arizona, engineered a bipartisan immigration bill that Republicans requested be part of a foreign aid package. While not a cure-all, this bill was a good start toward the kinds of reforms Representative Lawler suggests. Despite initial support by both parties, the bill failed, in large part at the behest of the Republicans' leading presidential candidate, Donald Trump. Representative Lawler's call for bipartisanship is most welcome. Unfortunately, it comes only in the wake of 2 tragic and unnecessary deaths. Let us hope that in the future it will take far less for Republicans to wake up. End of letter. Here is a letter written in answer to an article, Trump Shakes Up Immigration Crackdown Leadership, a news article from the New York Times of January 27th, written by Simon Cohen from Queens. The move by the Trump administration to remove the Border Patrol official Gregory Bovino from the anti-immigrant operation in Minnesota and replace him with Tom Homan, the president's border czar, feels like a way to take Mr. Bovino out of the line of fire and divert attention from the real issue. The real issue is President Trump's using an agency to enforce a draconian and violent program directed at non-white immigrants and their American citizen supporters. The program violates laws and the Constitution in multiple ways and has resulted in the killing of 2 American citizens, Renee Good and Alex Pretty. Whatever ICE was set up to do, it has become an army of occupation directed at democratic cities. Violating laws violently for political purposes seems like the essence of domestic terrorism. In this case, it is directed by the President's administration with the apparent support of the Republican Party. At this point, ICE should be defunded and disbanded. Congress should act in an adult manner to hold accountable those who killed Ms. Good and Mr. Pretty and violated the rights of many more. A new agency should be designed from the ground up for the stated purposes of immigration enforcement, one that operates according to the Constitution, the law, and not the whim of a self-proclaimed dictator. End of letter. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 2nd issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Kevin Siepel. Thank you for listening.